I remember the knock like it was yesterday, sharp against the door, like someone had thrown a brick wrapped in velvet. You never think much of a knock until the air itself seems to freeze in expectation. 3 hard raps, then a pause. Then 3 more. I had barely finished my morning tea, steam curling from the cup, when the sound made my heart jump in a way it hadn't in years. I called out, "Who's there?" in a voice that tried to sound calm, though I knew it didn't. There was a muffled reply, something about checking on me. Instantly, I knew this wasn't a neighbor, not a delivery, my nephew Derek, or maybe his girlfriend Tanya, or both. My pulse skipped a beat. I've lived alone for a long time, and I like it that way. Quiet, predictable. No one judging the way I folded laundry or left dishes in the sink for a few hours. And now, suddenly, the house felt alien, like a stranger was moving through my bones. Derek had been helping me for months, moving in little by little, at first for a week, then a month, then staying indefinitely, claiming it was for my safety. Tanya had followed, smiling too brightly, asking for my opinions and dismissing them with gentle chuckles. It all started small, too small to notice. I opened the door. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach, a scent that made my stomach twist. Derek's eyes were sharp, scanning my living room like a general assessing a battlefield. Tanya hovered behind him, arms folded, an anxious tightness around her mouth. "We just wanted to make sure you're feeling okay," Derek said. His tone was so smooth it made me flinch. "Feeling okay," I repeated. My voice sounded weaker than I intended. "Yes," he said quickly. "And we wanted to check the house. Make sure everything is safe." I nodded. Inside, something tightened. Safe. This was their house now, not mine. And yet I smiled, a small, polite smile that hid everything churning inside me. I could see every flaw in their little charade. The way Tanya avoided my eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. The way Derek's hand lingered too long on the banister, as if marking territory. I poured another cup of tea, holding it like a shield. I've learned over the years that a calm exterior can fool anyone, even those who think they're clever. And I had begun to learn their cleverness. I'd noticed the little changes first. My mail arriving late, grocery lists disappearing, my bills being handled without my knowledge. But they didn't know I noticed. Not yet. As I lifted the cup to my lips, I felt the tiniest spark of amusement, almost dark humor. I might have been playing the part of a frail, grateful old aunt, but inside, I was starting to see patterns. Patterns and plans. I set the cup down carefully and let them chatter on about their plans for the day. I nodded at the right moments. I smiled when I had to. And all the while, I made a promise to myself. I would not be trapped. I just had to wait for the right moment. And that's when I noticed it. A slip, small and almost invisible, but enough to give me my first real advantage. Something Derek thought he'd hidden perfectly, but I knew better. The slip I noticed that morning wasn't much. Just a letter lying sideways on the kitchen counter. But it was enough. Enough to remind me that nothing here belonged to them, not really, and that even the smallest oversight could become my lifeline. That's when I realized surviving wasn't about confronting them yet. It was about watching, learning, and pretending I didn't notice. The first rule of living with Derek and Tanya, I quickly understood, was patience. Everything had to be slow, everything framed as concern. "Aunt Maggie, you shouldn't be cooking alone," Tanya said one evening, standing in my doorway with her arms crossed, as if she were defending me from myself. "You could hurt your wrist again." I smiled, nodded, and thanked her for thinking of me. My hands shook slightly, but that was invisible to her. And so it began, rules, small but persistent, inserted under the guise of protection. No late-night calls, no solo errands, no financial decisions without their guidance. I was, according to them, fragile. Fragile enough to be patronized, fragile enough to be monitored. At first, I tried to resist. I made small choices against their wishes, a late cup of tea, a quick errand to the corner store. They noticed, of course. Derek's jaw tightened. Tanya's smile turned sharper, though polite. They didn't confront me directly. Confrontation, they knew, was messy. Subtle control was far more effective, and I, of course, played along. The elderly, grateful aunt act became my armor. I agreed, I nodded, I thanked them. They were careful not to humiliate me outright in public. They didn't need to. They were clever enough to let me think I had some agency, while slowly erasing the boundaries of my autonomy. But while I played the part, I began taking notes. Small notes at first, times when bills disappeared, when my mail arrived late, when Derek or Tanya suggested I was forgetting things. I labeled them carefully in a tiny notebook, hidden in the back of my linen closet. I also recorded conversations when I could, quietly clipping a small voice recorder to my cardigan during their lectures about my safety. It was exhausting, pretending passivity while memorizing every pattern. But it was also exhilarating in a quiet, terrible way. I had discovered the first secret of surviving. The more they underestimated me, the more power I had. Even then, the rules tightened faster than I expected. One day, I found my checkbook moved to a high shelf out of reach. Another day, my phone was missing, replaced by one with restricted calling. Derek insisted, kindly, that he was just helping manage things. Tanya nodded in agreement, whispering that it's for your own good. And yet, every action they took left a trace, a small misstep, a crack I could exploit. That sideways letter was only the beginning. I poured myself another cup of tea that night and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the life they were trying to cage me into. And as the warmth spread through my hands, I smiled faintly. I wasn't trapped. Not yet. And that's when I noticed the first real mistake, a careless password left written on a sticky note, right where I could see it. I could almost hear my plan whispering. Now we begin. That sticky note was almost laughable if it hadn't been so valuable. Derek had scribbled the password to my online banking on the edge of the kitchen counter, right where Tanya never bothered to look. I noticed it that evening while pretending to fuss with the teapot. It was a tiny mistake in a house full of carefully curated control, but to me, it felt like finding a thread dangling from a tapestry, one that might unravel the whole design. I didn't touch it immediately. That would have been too obvious. No, I simply memorized it, letting it sit in the back of my mind while continuing to play the part of the frail, grateful aunt. I smiled when Derek fussed over my grocery list. I nodded when Tanya suggested a new, safer routine for my mornings. Every smile, every nod, every thank you was a deliberate move on my part. They believed I was passive, but I was quietly mapping their movements, their schedules, their weaknesses. Daily life had become a series of rules, subtle punishments, and carefully wrapped lessons. Breakfast at 7, supervised because I might spill something. Medications at precisely 9, because one missed pill could be catastrophic. Television limited to 2 hours, because apparently my brain couldn't handle more. Even conversations with friends were now filtered through their presence. Calls screened, letters helpfully opened first. And yet, despite all this, I began to notice patterns. Derek always left his phone on the kitchen counter when he went into the garage. Tanya, in her obsessive tidiness, never checked the hall closet where I stashed my notebook. Their careful choreography wasn't perfect. It never is. People slip. They get careless. And each small slip was an opportunity. I began creating a silent catalog. Who left the front door unlocked, who carried keys in their pocket, which arguments escalated when they thought I wasn't listening. I recorded conversations, not just for proof, but to understand how they manipulated language. The way Derek's, "I'm just trying to help," was always coded with threat, or how Tanya's syrupy concern masked impatience and judgment. Every word, every gesture, every tone went into my mental ledger. And then came the first real test, a confrontation disguised as concern. Derek cornered me one evening about a late bill. "Aunt Maggie, why didn't you pay this on time? You know I handle everything so you don't have to stress." "I must have forgotten," I said softly, keeping my eyes on my cup, my hands steady. "You see," Derek said, voice tight, "it's exactly why I do this. You can't be trusted with these things." Tanya added, "We just want to make sure nothing goes wrong, for your sake." I smiled again, quietly savoring the irony. They thought they were tightening their control, but really they were giving me everything I needed. Patterns, mistakes, overconfidence, all of it feeding the plan I was constructing in silence. I poured another cup of tea that night and let the warmth soothe my hands. I could almost hear the plan taking shape in my mind, a slow, careful thing that required patience and observation. And that's when I realized they had underestimated one thing entirely, how patient I could be, and more importantly, how long I could wait. By the time I hit the 4th week of living under Derek and Tanya's care, the rules had become almost surgical in their precision. Breakfast at exactly 7 o'clock a.m., medications measured and served like a science experiment, and a constant parade of micro-reminders that I was somehow incapable of managing my own life. It wasn't overt abuse yet, not in the violent, in-your-face way people expect, but subtle control is far more insidious. Derek would hover near the counter as I brewed my tea, his gaze calculating. You know, Aunt Maggie, caffeine late in the day isn't good for your sleep. Maybe we should limit it. Tanya would nod emphatically, her tone syrupy. We just want the best for you. You don't want to wake up tired, do you? I smiled, always smiled, and nodded. Inside, I cataloged every infraction of logic and every assumption of weakness. Every time they spoke in that passive-aggressive, concern-laden tone, I recorded it mentally, and sometimes with the tiny recorder tucked discreetly into my cardigan. Every word, every gesture, every glance went into my invisible ledger. Then came the schedule. On a crisp Monday morning, I found it taped neatly to the fridge, a laminated chart detailing my day down to the minute. 7 o'clock a.m., breakfast. 9 o'clock a.m., exercise. 10:30 a.m., reading supervised. 12 o'clock p.m., lunch. 1:30 p.m., nap. 3 o'clock p.m., computer time only with supervision. 6 o'clock p.m., dinner. 9 o'clock p.m., lights out. I stared at it for a long while, holding my tea, thinking about how they must have felt clever. It was almost comedic, if it weren't terrifying. Every minute accounted for, every action monitored, every decision filtered through their lens of concern. And yet, while they tightened the grip, they didn't notice the tiny cracks forming in their routine. Derek left his laptop unlocked when he went to the garage, forgetting the sticky note password. Tanya, obsessively checking the house for any hint of my forgetfulness, never noticed my notebook tucked in the back of the linen closet. I began small experiments. A phone call to an old friend, just long enough to test if it would be overheard. A tiny withdrawal from my own bank account, recorded silently with my memorized password. Every slip I observed, every overreach they made, became a data point, a clue in the web I was beginning to weave. That week, Tanya scolded me for mismatching the laundry, while Derek lectured me about leaving a cupboard slightly ajar. I laughed politely, nodded, and accepted the chastisement. They thought they were molding me, controlling me, but in reality, they were revealing their patterns, their temperaments, and their overconfidence. And late that night, alone in the dim glow of my living room, I let myself feel a quiet thrill. They were clever, certainly, but not clever enough, not careful enough. Not careful enough to see the patient spider spinning her web in the shadows. It was in that quiet, late hour, while listening to their soft, snoring patterns from the bedroom, that I realized something crucial. They would slip, eventually. And when they did, I would be ready. By the 5th week, the atmosphere in the house had begun to thicken with unspoken rules and invisible boundaries. What had started as help had transformed into surveillance. Every corner, every habit, every breath I took seemed measured against some unseen standard. Derek's voice had grown sharper, though always polite, while Tanya's concern had begun to carry a sharp edge. It started with small things. My mail, which had been slightly delayed, now appeared carefully sorted, with bills already taken care of. My bank statements came with sticky notes in Derek's handwriting. "See, we've handled this. No need to worry." I noticed, of course, I always noticed. One afternoon, I decided to test the waters. I asked casually, could I take a short walk to the corner store? Derek's brow furrowed. You know, it's not exactly safe. What if something happens? Tanya stepped in, her voice saccharine. We could go with you, Aunt Maggie, just to be sure. I nodded, smiled, and said, that would be lovely, all the while making a mental note. They assumed I couldn't be trusted alone. Perfect. That evening, they began implementing what I came to think of as the layered rules. My access to the computer became strictly limited. My phone, though still mine, was now under the guise of monitoring for scams. Social visits were subtly discouraged. One friend called, and Tanya exclaimed, "Oh, Aunt Maggie, you really shouldn't be entertaining visitors." It's too much effort for you. I let it slide. I let everything slide. The more they tried to control me, the more information I gathered. I observed Derek's routines, the times he left the house, when he checked his email, when he drank too much coffee and became distracted. I studied Tanya's movements, noting how she cleaned obsessively when nervous and how her overconfidence often left small mistakes behind. One evening, while making tea, I noticed Tanya leave the kitchen and forget to lock the pantry door. Inside, in a small drawer, was my old journal, which they had been rifling through, carelessly, it seemed, thinking I wouldn't notice. I retrieved it quietly and began copying its contents into my hidden notebook. Every entry, every observation, every slight indignity now had a permanent record. That night, I lay awake listening to their conversation through the thin walls. Derek muttered, "She's getting more forgetful. We have to be more careful." And Tanya replied, with a tone I could almost taste, "I know, but we can't let her see we're tightening the reins. She's still too sharp for that." Sharp. That word, uttered with caution, made me smile quietly in the dark. They thought they were clever, but they had underestimated one thing: patience. I knew the patterns, I knew the schedules, and I had started leaving tiny breadcrumbs, testing what they noticed, what they missed. Each small experiment, each observation, brought me closer to understanding exactly when and how they would slip. That's when the first real danger appeared. Something small, almost insignificant, but enough to remind me that even careful planning can be derailed by a single moment of misjudgment. It started with a small misstep, but one that made my pulse race in ways the weeks of careful observation never had. That afternoon, I reached for my teacup, the one Derek had helpfully moved to the top shelf because he claimed I might knock it over, and Tanya's hand shot out from nowhere, gripping my wrist. "You can't do that," she said sharply, voice clipped. "I mean it, you're not careful enough." I pulled my wrist back slowly, letting a smile play at the corners of my lips. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I'll be more careful." Inside, I felt a thrill, not of fear exactly, but of awareness. This was the first time their concern had crossed into outright aggression. From that day, the subtle manipulations became more deliberate. Derek would hover in doorways when I tried to do anything alone. Tanya started monitoring even my smallest movements, offering advice that was really veiled threats. "We wouldn't want you to hurt yourself, would we?" she said one morning, leaning too close over my shoulder as I folded laundry. I let it happen. Every move, every tightening of their grip was a test. And I was learning how far I could push, how far I could bend without breaking. Every day, I documented. Every whispered threat, every clipped comment, every time Derek's hand lingered too long on a cupboard handle. I had my notebook, my hidden phone, my recorder. I knew that these tiny instruments were my allies. One evening, a confrontation began to brew. Derek had been unusually irritable after a long day at work. He slammed a cupboard door while I poured soup. "You can't even do one thing right," he barked. I froze, holding the ladle midair, and kept my face calm. I'll try again," I whispered. Tanya's voice rose softly, almost sweetly. "He's only worried because he wants what's best for you, Aunt Maggie. You need to understand that." I nodded, all while memorizing the exact volume of their voices, the way Derek's hand trembled slightly when he slammed things, the way Tanya's eyes darted when she thought I wasn't looking. They were giving me data, they just didn't know it. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table, writing everything down. Every sharp word, every controlling gesture. It was becoming clear, the abuse was escalating. But so was my resolve. And I knew one thing, one slip, one real mistake on their part, and I would have everything I needed. And then it happened, a careless remark from Derek, so small it almost went unnoticed. But it revealed something they would regret more than they could imagine. It was a phrase Derek let slip while pacing the living room, tossing a stack of my mail onto the table like it carried some hidden poison. "She wouldn't know how to manage this if we weren't here," he muttered to Tanya, louder than he realized. I froze mid-step, my tea forgotten on the counter. That tiny sentence, a casual admission, barely noticed by most, was a key. They had revealed exactly what they feared, my competence. They thought I was fragile, forgetful, incapable. And in that assumption lay my first real advantage. From that moment, I began to plan in earnest. Every small slip, every overconfident phrase became part of the strategy. Derek's pride, Tanya's constant need to appear perfect, their insistence that I could do nothing alone, they were all tools I could use. I had the patience to wait, and they had the arrogance to underestimate me. That evening, I made a small move, testing the waters. While Derek was in the garage and Tanya occupied with the laundry, I pulled the sticky note from the counter, the one with my bank password, and committed the details to memory for the second time, reinforcing a secret I knew I would need. I didn't touch the accounts, didn't log in. I simply memorized, cataloged, and waited. The following days became a delicate dance. Derek and Tanya continued to tighten their control, adding new rules each morning, as though stacking invisible walls around me. But their overconfidence made them careless. Derek would leave his laptop unlocked while in the garage. Tanya would wander off mid-sentence, forgetting I could hear everything. One evening, Tanya lectured me about my computer usage. "You really shouldn't be spending so much time online," she said, voice honeyed but sharp. "It's stressful, Aunt Maggie. For your own good, we need to limit it." I nodded, smiling faintly, and let her scold me. Every reprimand became a lesson in observing behavior. How she gestured, the small uptick in her voice when she felt she had the upper hand, the way her eyes darted nervously when I pretended to be obedient. Each detail was noted, cataloged, stored. And then the perfect opportunity presented itself. Derek, in his usual arrogance, left the house one afternoon for groceries without locking the door. Tanya, convinced I was too fragile to notice, left a spare key on the counter. My pulse quickened, but I remained outwardly calm, taking note rather than action. This was no reckless move yet, it was reconnaissance. For the first time, I allowed myself a quiet sense of satisfaction. They thought they were clever, that I was weak. In reality, every slip, every careless word, every overconfidence became a stone I could use to build my eventual escape. That night, I realized the most dangerous moment was approaching. Not for me, but for them. And that one wrong move could turn my carefully constructed patience into immediate action. I could feel the air in the house shift, that weak, heavy and impatient, like a storm that hasn't yet broken. Derek had grown more tense, snapping at small things. The way the rug was slightly crooked, the cupboard doors left ajar. Tanya hovered near him, her perfect smile masking irritation, her eyes flicking toward me constantly, as though expecting me to falter at any moment. But their paranoia was my advantage. Each microaggression, each clipped sentence, gave me more information. When Derek lost his temper, when Tanya left herself exposed in her need to maintain appearances, when I could move without being noticed, and I began to take my first real steps forward, cautiously, deliberately. One evening, while Derek was at the grocery store, Tanya came into the kitchen, humming softly, arranging the dishes I had left drying. I pulled out my notebook, the one tucked in the back of the linen closet, and began transferring all my mental notes into a single, coherent document. Every date, every conversation, every passive-aggressive remark was now tangible evidence. I paused occasionally, listening for footsteps, but the house was quiet. Later, I tested the first boundary. I accessed my online banking, quietly and carefully, using the memorized password from the sticky note. It was a small thing, a controlled rebellion, but it reminded me that I still had autonomy. My accounts were intact, my finances under my control. I noted every transaction, every helpful deposit or withdrawal they had made without my knowledge, cataloging each discrepancy like a detective following a trail. Then came the psychological test. I deliberately mislaid a letter, then waited to see who would notice first. Derek stormed into the room the next morning, his expression taut. "You misplaced this again," he demanded, though the letter had been in his own stack the entire time. Tanya looked at me with concern, whispering, "Aunt Maggie, you really must keep track of these things. You know how important they are." I smiled faintly, nodded, and agreed, hiding my inward amusement. They thought they were teaching me a lesson, but really they were exposing their own weaknesses, how quickly they lost patience, how easily they overreacted, how predictable their routines had become. That night, I set up the small recorder in my bedroom, clipped beneath the bed skirt. It was subtle, undetectable unless someone looked specifically. I added a backup copy of my notebook to a small lockbox in the attic, the one place they never went because it was too dusty and unsafe. Each precaution I took reinforced the invisible web I was weaving around them, when I could pull at the perfect moment. And yet, I knew better than to act recklessly. Patience was my ally. Timing was everything. I could almost feel the moment approaching, the moment when their carelessness would finally create an opening I could exploit. And then, just as I began to feel the first real surge of control, Derek returned home earlier than expected, and he brought a surprise that would test everything I had prepared. Derek came home earlier than I expected that evening, the grocery bags swinging from his hands, his brow tight with irritation. Tanya followed behind him, humming a tune that had lost all sweetness in the context of the house's tension. I was in the kitchen, pretending to fuss over my tea, carefully keeping my hands steady, my smile polite. "Back early," I said lightly, not looking up. My words floated harmlessly in the air, but I was calculating. Derek's face tightened, a tell I had come to know well. "Yes," he muttered, dropping the bags on the counter with more force than necessary. He rifled through a receipt, muttering about a missing item. Tanya hovered, watching me, but pretending to check the refrigerator. It was then that Derek made the slip. He turned toward me, voice low but sharp, and muttered, almost unconsciously, "I don't know why she even thinks she can manage anything without us." I froze mid-breath, a small, imperceptible shiver running down my spine. That single careless remark, repeated almost as an afterthought, was everything I needed. I smiled politely, quietly noting every detail. The angle of his shoulders, the tone of his voice, Tanya's quick glance at the floor, betraying her own unease. I didn't speak. I didn't react. The house had taught me the value of stillness. Sometimes the quietest moments were the most dangerous, and sometimes they were the most useful. I waited until Derek and Tanya were distracted, Derek recounting a minor complaint about the store, Tanya fussing over the arrangement of cans in the pantry, before making my move. Slowly, I retrieved the small recorder I had hidden beneath the bed skirt, ensuring it was active and capturing every word. My notebook, tucked under the table, sat ready, pen poised for any new notes. That night, I reflected on the careful strategy I had built. Every observation, every slip, every tiny piece of evidence was coming together. I could see a path forward now, a way to reclaim the control they had stripped from me without alerting them. Patience had brought me to this moment. Observation had prepared me. And now opportunity was knocking. But opportunity was dangerous. Acting too soon could ruin everything. I reminded myself of that as I moved quietly through the house, noting each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of fabric, each distracted gesture. The storm was approaching, and I had to be ready to strike without hesitation, but with precision. I sat down at the table with my tea, heart pounding quietly in my chest. For the first time, I felt a strange combination of fear and exhilaration. Everything I had endured, every passive-aggressive remark, every minor humiliation, every careful observation, it had led to this. And then it happened. Tanya made a move so reckless, so careless, that it changed everything and forced me to act faster than I had planned. It happened faster than I had expected. Tanya, flustered and impatient, left the front door unlocked while she fussed over an argument with Derek in the kitchen. I had been observing, as always, my notebook and hidden recorder at the ready, when she leaned back too far and nearly knocked over a vase on the entry table. The crash of porcelain on tile sent a sharp thrill through me, not fear, but readiness. Derek barked at her, his voice sharp enough to make my ears ring. "How many times do I have to tell you to be careful?" I didn't," Tanya started, but Derek cut her off with a frustrated hand gesture. I stayed seated at the table, pretending to sip tea, letting their tension unfold like a poorly acted play. But inside, every neuron in my brain was firing, cataloging their movements, their mistakes, and the exact moment the moment to act presented itself. That moment came when Derek turned toward me abruptly, raising his voice. "And you, what were you thinking leaving the mail on the counter like that?" His hand slammed down on the table, rattling my teacup. I kept my expression neutral. "I must have misplaced it," I said softly. "I'm sorry." Tanya looked at me, her eyes wide, caught between concern and fear. And that was when they made the biggest mistake. They assumed I was fragile, incapable, and passive. They had no idea I had spent weeks preparing. I pressed a small button under the table. The hidden recorder sent audio to my backup phone, which automatically uploaded the files to a secure cloud account. At the same time, a preset emergency alert I had carefully crafted months ago pinged the local authorities, my lawyer, and a social worker I trusted. All of it was automatic. All of it was ready for this exact scenario. Derek's face turned pale when he realized I was no longer the passive observer they had assumed me to be. Tanya's lips parted, as if she could say something, but no words came. The house seemed to hold its breath. Moments later, the first knocks came at the door. Then another. Then voices, firm, authoritative, police, social workers, medical personnel. I let them in, my smile calm, my voice steady, hiding the adrenaline coursing through me. Derek tried to protest, but the officers already had the evidence I had so carefully collected. Tanya stammered, caught in her own lies, as the investigators began taking notes, reviewing my recordings, and cross-referencing my meticulously logged incidents. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift. The house, once a cage, suddenly became a stage on which justice was unfolding. I was no longer the victim, they were exposed. Every manipulative word, every subtle threat, every attempt to undermine me had been catalogued and would now hold consequence. And as Derek and Tanya were led away, struggling and shouting, I realized that the quiet I had so desperately sought wasn't just the absence of noise. It was freedom. But reclaiming it would require one final step. The house was quiet after they left. Truly quiet, not the tense, controlled silence that Derek and Tanya had imposed, but the kind of quiet that feels like air finally moving freely through a room. I walked through the living room slowly, touching the furniture, breathing deeply, and savoring each sound that wasn't measured, corrected, or monitored. For the first time in months, I felt like I owned this space again. The police had taken their statements. Social services had assessed my home and my safety. My lawyer reassured me that the financial controls they had exerted over my bank accounts, my credit, my personal records would be restored. I was no longer under their shadow, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe without planning, calculating, or pretending. It wasn't immediate relief. It was careful, tentative freedom. I checked my accounts, recovered my mail, and slowly began to reclaim the things they had controlled. My schedule, my daily routines, my autonomy. It was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time, because I had spent months being taught, subtly, that I was incapable of managing anything alone. And now I had to relearn trust, not in them, but in myself. Friends and neighbors who had sensed something wrong but didn't speak up until the evidence was undeniable began visiting. Their faces were filled with disbelief and concern, but also admiration. I smiled politely and let them in. They didn't understand the quiet battle I had waged in the shadows, but they recognized its victory. In the days that followed, I took deliberate steps to reinforce my independence. I installed locks I controlled, set up new systems for mail and finances, and reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in months. Most importantly, I allowed myself small pleasures without guilt, an evening with a book, a walk around the neighborhood, tea at sunrise. Each act was both rebellion and reclamation. I also began thinking of others, as I often did. People like me, older, underestimated, and quietly vulnerable, needed guidance. I started volunteering at a community center, helping seniors recognize manipulation, protect their autonomy, and trust their instincts. Sharing my story, teaching what I had learned, was empowering in ways I hadn't anticipated. As I sat on the porch one morning, feeling the sun on my face, I realized something profound. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, it observes, it plans, and when the moment comes, it acts with precision. That truth had saved me, and it would guide me into the life I had fought to reclaim. And as the wind stirred the curtains gently that afternoon, I understood something else. Freedom is not just being safe. It's knowing you can step forward into the world again, on your own terms. And I was ready. The first night alone after Derek and Tanya were gone, I slept with the windows open. The air smelled like rain and earth, not bleach and tension. I woke without a sense of dread, without the phantom weight of someone monitoring my every movement. For the first time in months, the house belonged entirely to me. It took time to adjust. The rituals they had imposed, strict schedules, constant supervision, endless micromanagement, were so ingrained that I caught myself hesitating before making even the smallest decision. But each choice I reclaimed, what to eat, when to read, which drawer to open, was a quiet triumph. I was no longer living under their rules. I was living under mine. I also took the time to address what had been broken. Financial accounts were restored, bills paid, personal records secured. Doctors and social workers confirmed that my health had not. I began taking small steps toward life I had postponed for too long. Afternoons spent in the garden, walks through the park, even a short trip to the countryside. Each experience reminded me that the world was wide and waiting, not something to fear. I joined a local senior community group and shared my story, teaching others how to recognize control and manipulation, how to safeguard their autonomy, and how to trust their instincts. The most important lesson I carried forward was the quiet strength I had discovered. I had learned that resilience doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, it watches, and it acts at the precise moment. I had waited, I had watched, and now I was finally free. And as I sat on the porch, sipping tea and listening to the wind stir the curtains, I smiled. Freedom wasn't just about safety or absence of threat. It was about reclaiming control over your life, your choices, and your joy. I had done it. I was alive, independent, and whole again. The house, once a cage, had become a sanctuary. The silence that had terrified me was now comforting. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I looked forward to the future with clear eyes and an open heart.